Thank you all for coming. Really, I really do appreciate it. I think it's good. You're going to be, those of you who are here who haven't heard Dr. Appel speak, I think you're going to learn a lot. I mean, a lot. He's just an outstanding speaker. A little bit of background. I grew up in Batesville. This is where I went to high school. Left, went into the military and did my thing there. And right now I'm the CEO of the Arkansas Voter Integrity Initiative. And one of our missions is to train people, is to educate people on the current voting system that we have. So many people in Arkansas just have no clue. They just have no clue, to include the Secretary of State, to include the Director of Elections in Arkansas and everybody else. They don't know how these machines work. We just all assume that everybody's crossed their T's, dot their I's, and they know what they're doing. They do not. They simply do not. And so AVII is trying to reach out and teach people as best we can. And so Dr. Appel was one of the key people that I reached out to over a year ago, because he's well known and considered one of the top experts, if not the top expert in America on these voting machines. So let me tell you a little bit about him real quick. Andrew W. Appel is the Eugene Higgins Professor of Computer Science at Princeton University, where he's been on the faculty since 1986. He served as a department chair from 2009 to 2015. His research is in software verification, computer security, programming languages and compilers, and technology policy. He received his A.B. summa cum laude in physics from Princeton University in 1981, and his Ph.D. in computer science from Carnegie Mellon University in 1985. I mean, when I graduated, mine was, thank God Almighty, that was what I got when I graduated. But he's done, again, he's well known. You see him on ABC, NBC. He's considered an expert. He's testified before the U.S. Congress. He's written many books. And we are so happy to have him. And at the end of this, you're going to have plenty of time to ask questions. And so that when people tell you something, you will have the knowledge to say, I don't think you're right there. I took the time to go talk to the expert. You didn't. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Appel.
Thank you. I don't need the mic.
Okay.
You can hear me. Let me talk about voting machines. Here's a whole bunch of different kinds of voting machines. Here are the touch screens. Here are the ballot marking devices. Here are the optical scanners. They're all computers. And all computers can be hacked. What does it mean to hack a computer? It means you install different software in there than was authorized. Computers will run any software you install in them. And you've all installed new software or new apps in your computers. You've all installed operating system upgrades that they send you every month. And now it's running something different than it ran last time. So it's not that the manufacturers deliberately build vote-stealing software into their computers. It's that unauthorized people can install unauthorized software. So that's the fundamental flaw of voting machines. A voting machine is just a computer in a box, and whoever programs that computer, whoever installs the software, decides whether it's going to report the legitimate vote totals that it read off the touchscreen or counted on the op scanner, or whether it will report the hacker's favorite result totals. Now, there's no credible evidence that this has ever happened in a major election, and pretty soon I'll explain why I believe I can say that. But it's still a real threat that could happen in any future election, and we should organize our democracy to run elections in a way that we can trust. So, voting machines are hackable. What's the solution? There's a lot of contests on the ballot. You vote for many different things, and human beings aren't actually that great at, counting things accurately. The voting machines, when they're not hacked, are extremely accurate. And we sort of hope and assume that almost all the time they're not hacked. So the way you can combine the strength of the voting machine, which is its accuracy and its speed, with the strength of human beings who, if we have 2 or 3 or 5 of them counting the votes together, watching each other, we can trust, because our guy will be one of those people. It works like this. mark an optical scan paper ballot by hand by filling in the bubbles, feed it through an optical scan voting machine, which counts it, or maybe instead of having the optical scan voting machine at the precinct, the polling place, you could have it at the county election office, and at the polling place you put your ballot into the ballot box, and it's carried to the county office with a proper chain of custody, like 2 people taking it there, keeping an eye on each other instead of just one. Now, the problem is that voting machine is a computer. It could be hacked. Maybe somebody can reprogram it to shift 8% of the votes from candidate Smith to candidate Jones. But those paper ballots that were marked by the voters with a pen, it's hard to hack a pen, are in the ballot box under the optical scan voting machine. And that sealed ballot box is kept in the vault, and it's available for recounts or audits by humans who can look at the marks without having some computer interpret and say, oh, here's what the marks say. You can see it for yourself. So back in 2006, most of the country voted on paper ballots marked with a pen, counted by optical scanners. That would be these counties all over the country marked in the dark green. And many states used paperless touchscreen machines. So you touch something on a screen and there's no paper ballot at all. There was nothing to recount. And some counties in Arkansas were voting that way. Whatever was in the program in that computer, and it said at the end of the election night, candidate Smith got 300 votes and candidate Jones got 200. That's all there is. There's no paper ballots to recount. Some counties in Arkansas, all of the counties in my state of New Jersey were voting that way. And it was completely untrustworthy. We sort of hope and assume that those machines weren't hacked and they were probably giving us the right totals, but that's no way to run an election, having to trust that nobody interfered with the software in those machines from the time they were manufactured till the time they're in the polling place in this year's election. In 2020, things had improved quite a bit. That a lot of those states that were using paperless touchscreen voting machines had understood this issue and switched to hand-marked paper ballots counted by optical scanners, recountable by hand, auditable by hand. So again, all these counties marked in green were voting that way in 2020. Now, as you may recall, there was some controversy in the election of 2020 about whether the machines were hacked to, count the votes a different way. And in a couple of states, including, for example, Georgia, they actually did recount the paper ballots. Now, if it had been 2006 in Georgia, there wouldn't have been any paper ballots. And you would just have to take the machine's word for it. And that would have been very uncomfortable. But by now, Georgia at least has some form of paper ballots. Not a great form of paper ballots, as I'll explain. And so if the controversy had been in 2020 about Louisiana, we would have been in that difficult situation of the computers say this, and there's no paper ballots that you could recount to learn anything different. Now it's 2024, so even more states have switched to hand-marked paper ballots counted by optical scan voting machines, recountable by hand. And so there has been real progress in the trustworthiness of elections. The machines themselves could still be hacked, but we have those paper ballots marked by the voters with a pen. So the mark got onto the paper without the interference of a computer, and the mark can be read by humans without the interference of a computer. But let me talk about ballot marking devices. These were invented 20 or 30 years ago as a disability accommodation for those voters who could not mark an optical scan paper ballot with a pen. They could use the audio interface and the buttons marked in Braille, so that accommodated voters with visual disabilities. Or if If their hand was too shaky to hold the pen, the touchscreen might work for them. And after you use the ballot marking device, it would print out one of those optical scan bubble ballots with the ovals filled in, except the ovals would be filled in by the printer. And that's a pretty reasonable accommodation for voters with disabilities who couldn't vote any other way. But what happened starting around 2016 or 2018 is that some states started to use these ballot marking devices for all voters, not just voters with disabilities. And so this is what it would look like, as you probably well know. You vote on a touch screen like this, and when you're done interacting with the touch screen, it prints out a ballot card that looks something like this. And each of these barcodes is the encoding of one vote in terms of the ballot position. And each of these lines is supposed to correspond to one of those barcodes. The barcode way up at top says which precinct you're in, so that the voting machine will know which candidates you're allowed to vote on. And in principle, this is supposed to be secure because you had the chance to review every vote printed on that ballot before you put it in the optical scanner, which will read all the barcodes and count those votes. And if the ballot marking device is hacked, it's just a computer, it's just as easy to hack as any other kind of voting machine, then it could cheat by printing different things onto the paper than the ones that you indicated on the touch screen. Now, what would happen if it did that? The protection is supposed to be that your ballot choices are printed in human-readable text that are supposed to be the things you would use in a recount. So that, in principle, the recount is supposed to protect you against computer hacking, because you, the voter, got to see what was here. And the recount team will recount, in principle, from the human-readable text and not from the barcodes, which they can't see. But if you were to do recounts by just running those ballots through the optical scanners again, the recounts would be counting the barcodes, not the human-readable text. And that's assuming that the optical scanners aren't hacked. And if one of the purposes of the recount is to get to the ground truth of what's actually on those ballots that you can see with your own eyes, as a protection against the possibility of hacking, then recounts really ought to be done by people looking at the ballots, reading the part that they can see. Yeah. But still, you're supposed to be protected because the voters got to see this part, and the recount team could see this part if your state had recount laws which says that you will actually look at this part, which unfortunately your state does not. But your state is not alone. There are a lot of states that do it in that screwy way. But suppose you fix that and you recount by looking at the human readable part of the paper ballot. The problem is most voters don't review the paper ballot very carefully. And that's been measured. And let me explain how these scientific studies were able to measure how carefully voters look at their paper ballots. The first study was done in 2018 by researchers from Georgia Tech who conducted a study at an early vote center in Tennessee. And what they did, this early vote center used express vote machines, which you're familiar with. So there's a bunch of express vote machines. There's one optical scanner. The voters mark their ballot on the express votes, carry them over to the optical scanner, deposit them. And the research team stood over against the wall, like election observers are permitted to do, and they just timed how many seconds each voter looked at their ballot while they're carrying it over before they put it in the machine, in the optical scanner. And 47% of the voters didn't look at it at all. So if the machine had been hacked and put a different candidate on the printer, they wouldn't notice. 53% of the voters did look at the ballot. They looked at it for an average of 3.9 seconds, which is, there were 18 contests on that ballot, so that's a quarter of a second per contest. And you might think that if the machine had been cheating in the race for sheriff, they wouldn't have noticed. Well, in this study done in Michigan with real voters and a real voting machine, but in a mock election, they set up the voting machine to deliberately change the voter's vote in one contest on the ballot. Now you see why it was done in a mock election, because if it was done in the real election, they would have been hauled off to jail for that. That's a felony of hacking a voting machine in a real election. And what they found is only 6.6%, let's generously say 7% of the voters noticed the error and said something about it. And this is not too surprising. Last time you got cash from the cash machine, how carefully did you look at the receipt? You know, if voters are looking at, if half the voters aren't looking at their ballot at all and the other half are looking for 4 seconds, what's the odds they're going to notice one change in this difficult to read list? So that's in Michigan. Michigan voters are not perfect at following the instructions to review their ballots. And I don't think Michigan voters are all that different from voters anywhere else. We are human, right? If the machine wasn't hacked the last 5 times we went out to vote, then on the 6th time, we're not going to bother to look at the ballot very carefully. So, consequently, what does that mean? If people aren't reviewing their ballots, what does that mean for the ability of the election to be trustworthy? And so we gamed out the following math. Suppose the machine is trying to shift 5% of the votes for Smith to be votes for Jones. Or rather, 5% of all the votes from Smith votes to Jones votes. If you're going to hack a voting machine, you don't make it shift all the votes to Jones. That's too obvious. You know, don't be too greedy. Just shift a bunch of votes so it's not too obvious. So that's 1 out of 20 ballots has something on the printout that the voter didn't mark on the touch screen. And now suppose 7% of the voters, 1 out of 15 voters, would catch that error if it were there on the paper. That means 1 out of every 300 voters is going to notice something and say something about it. And if they tell the poll worker, this ballot has a different vote on it than what I indicated on the touch screen, what's the poll worker supposed to do? Well, I'll tell you what they're supposed to do, and let's assume they do it. They're supposed to say, that's all right, sir. That's all right, ma'am. We can void that one, and you can do it over. The voter does it over, looks good, put it in the machine. So what that means is, if the machine set out to steal 5% of the votes, it can only succeed in stealing 93% of 5% of the votes, 4.5% of the votes, because all the other voters that aren't checking are vulnerable to have their vote stolen. Now, what's the fix for this? Well, you could tell the voters to check their ballots more carefully, and the Michigan study tried different variations of that, and you can imagine how well it worked, which is not very well, and next year they're going to pay even less attention. People are people, and we have to design our election systems for people until all the voters are AIs, and then it'll be a different game entirely. All right, so what that means is, that 1 out of every 300 voter who actually said something, those people caught the machine cheating red-handed. And in many types of crime, you can imagine if you catch somebody doing it red-handed, then something can be done about it. But what can be done about it? Suppose someone goes to the Secretary of State and says, in every polling place where there were, 600 voters voting, there were 2 people that raised their hand in each polling place and said, that's not what was on, the touch screen. That's evidence that maybe 5% of the votes are being stolen, but the Secretary of State can't cancel the results of the election and have a do-over because 2 voters in every precinct saw something wrong. I mean, they might have been mistaken. They might be lying. They can't prove what was on the touch screen. So what that means is there's no remedy for if you detect the wrong vote on your ballot. Yeah, you can prevent your vote from being stolen, but what about all your neighbors' votes who didn't check as closely as you? And that makes ballot marking devices a bad technology. You cannot conduct trustworthy elections with ballot marking devices, because what's on the ballot is what will be counted in the recount. All the recounts in the world will not fix the problem if the wrong vote is already there on the paper ballot. So the solution: what's the best known high-tech method of conducting elections we can trust? It's mark votes with a pen, count the ballots with optical scan voting machines, which, when they're not hacked, are very accurate and they're efficient and quick, and they give you the result on election night, not the certified official result, but the preliminary result that's generally the right thing. And then audit or recount the paper ballots by hand to make sure that this year the machines weren't hacked too. Okay? Now, I'm going to talk about audits. A recount is easy to understand. You look at every ballot and you count up how many votes for each candidate. You can do it by a statistical random sample to detect with very high assurance, by looking at a sample of the ballots, that the machines did not cheat. So I'll come back and talk more about the mechanics of audits a little later. So by now, almost all the country has hand-marked paper ballots counted by machine, except these counties colored in yellow, which use ballot marking devices, and I've explained why that's a problem. And these counties marked in red that are much worse than that because there's no paper ballot at all. Yeah. Now, those paper ballots don't do much good if nobody ever looks at them. Right? And that's true even for the hand-marked, is that true? Yes. Even with hand-marked paper ballots, like they use in all these states, if the optical scanners are hacked and they miscount the hand-marked ballots, then somebody could get away with cheating unless there's a mechanism for looking at the paper ballots independent of the computers. And that's called an audit. And lots of states have some sort of random audit law, but most of them aren't very effective. They don't do it in a way that would actually give you confidence if it passes the audit, then there really was no hacking. But a few states have what's called risk-limiting audits, which is a design of that random sample that will give you actual assurance that if it passes the audit, then the election outcome is the same as the computers claimed. And so here are the states that, in the last 5 or 10 years, or even more recently, have implemented some form of risk-limiting audit to actually look at the paper ballot in an organized way and make it mean something. That's not very encouraging, actually. That in all those other states that nicely have hand-marked paper ballots, if there's a suspicion that causes some judge to order a recount, then you can be confident because the votes marked on the paper are the ones that the voters marked. That's good. But there's no organized way to do it in general unless somebody can convince a judge that a recount is necessary. So more of the states should have laws, or if not more of the states, at least more of the counties should have laws that say that after the optical scan election, you should look at the paper ballots and count up the votes and make sure that the optical scanners weren't hacked this time. Now, what's the most efficient form of doing that? When you have a large number of ballots and large margins of victory, then there are statistical ways of doing it by looking at only a few of the ballots. And I can explain that. And it turns out that when you have a small number of ballots, the statistical methods will work, but they're not actually any faster than just counting all the ballots. And so if you wanted to have in this county a state-of-the-art audit law as good as the best of the states, you could do it by hand marking paper ballots, counting them by optical scan voting machine, and recounting them by hand, not on election night. They've been working the polls for 12 hours. That's not the right time to count ballots, but in the 15 days before certification. So, mark votes with a pen. Arkansas state law permits this, permits counties to do it that way. Count those ballots on election night or within 24 hours by an optical scan voting machine. That is a recommendation of election security experts, and Arkansas state law requires you to count the ballots with an optical scan voting machine. So those are in sync. And then audit or recount the paper ballots by hand, not on election night when everybody's tired, but in an organized way in the period in the days after the election. And Arkansas state law gives you 15 days before the certification of the election in which to accomplish that. And as I said, I can describe high-tech methods for the audits, but when the number of ballots is on the order of, only 10,000, then just the recount is a very effective way of doing it. And that concludes the sort of presentation part, and now we can go right to the Q&A.
Up here,
Yeah.
we hear all the time that the local county clerks do logic and accuracy tests, which will prove 100% that the machines are acting the way they're supposed to act. How would you counter that when we're told that that's okay because we have,
Right.
It's okay to have touchscreens because we do that?
So the purpose of a logic and accuracy test is to check that the ballot design, that is the data file that lists who the candidates are and what position on the ballot they are, is accurate. If I were going to hack a voting machine to cheat, and I have demonstrated this hack for a court in New Jersey 15 years ago, my computer program would have one extra line of software that says, is it election day? If it's not election day, I will behave very carefully and count the votes very accurately. And if it's election day, then I will shift 8% of the votes from one candidate to another. Now, the logic and accuracy tests are done before election day. They cannot be done on election day because the voting machines are busy with something else. So logic and accuracy tests were never meant to be a defense against hacking. They're meant to be a defense against mistakes and screw-ups by election administrators. And election administrators are only human, so the good ones put in these kinds of defenses and checks against mistakes and screw-ups so they can get it right every time. But the LNA tests cannot be used to, protect against hacking. Yes?
You have used the word hacking a number of times, which seems to assume that the original product, as it comes off the line with the software and everything, does exactly what we all think it's supposed to do. And is that really a safe assumption that it, from the very beginning, is good? Because my understanding is that we're not allowed to see this software. It's proprietary. Have you ever seen the software yourself? Have you ever read through the lines of code of the software?
Yes, actually.
Okay, so
not on the voting machines you use here, but on the same voting machines that Louisiana now uses and New Jersey used to use, that in the context of a court case, the judge ordered that they had to give me the software to look at. And somebody gets to read that software. The testing labs that are accredited by the U.S. Election Assistance Commission do get to read that software. In order to worry about whether the voting machines are hacked, it's not necessary to assume bad faith on the part of the voting machine companies or that there's some insider at the voting machine company who's hacking it, although that's certainly possible. The problem is it's software. And we know that in all the other realms of life where we have to use computers and software, they get hacked all the time. The reason you get a new operating system upgrade for your computer every month is because they've discovered that many more bugs that they have to patch with new versions of their operating system. Every month you read about another 100,000 healthcare records that have been stolen through some hack. That software is very difficult to secure. And so the job of protecting a voting machine against somebody installing unauthorized software is sufficiently difficult that we cannot assume that all these voting machine companies and all these counties are doing it successfully all the time. Even if you could read the software source code, you have no guarantee that that's what's actually shipped with the machine. And even if that was shipped with the machine 4 years ago, you have no guarantee that that's what's in the machine now. So I don't place a lot of emphasis on, did I get to read the source code? It doesn't matter what's in the source code. What matters is what's in the machine today, and we have very little way of testing that. Yes?
One of the objections that the state is pointing out is there's no modem or anything in the equipment to be able to connect to the internet.
Right. So
Have you ever taken one apart to determine if there is a modem, and if not, could it not be?
let me address that point. So the question is, if the voting machine doesn't have a network connection, doesn't have a plug for the network to go into, and doesn't have a wireless radio, that's what the modem is about, then how could it be hacked? And the answer is, did you ever put a memory card into your computer, or a memory card into your camera, back when we had cameras that weren't phones, or a floppy disk into your computer, if you're old enough, okay? Removable media. Now, every voting machine uses removable media, and they need to for two reasons. Before each election, somebody needs to tell the voting machine which candidate names to display in which contests, right? That's called the ballot definition. It's a data file, and because these voting machines don't have network connections, and it's a good thing they don't have network connections, what the election administrator has to do is use their Windows laptop at County Central to write the ballot definition to the removable media, the little memory card or the USB stick, and then plug that into the voting machine. That transfers the data file to the voting machine so that it knows what candidates are on the ballot. That's reason one. Reason two is all these voting machines occasionally get software upgrades. New versions of the software that come out, maybe because some state over there needs a new kind of voting algorithm, this instant runoff or this whatever that wasn't envisioned originally, so there's a software upgrade for the voting machine. And so all these voting machines are designed, every one of them, that you can upgrade the software by that same removable media. You put it in the slot, it reads it, installs it, and that's what it's running now. And it has been demonstrated multiple times on different voting machines that you can hack the machine by piggybacking the malware onto the same memory card that the unsuspecting election administrator is using to install the ballot definition. And it can even propagate from one voting machine to another that way, or from the voting machine back to the County Central election management computer. Or if the voting machine company, is a small to medium-sized company with its dozen engineers or so working on voting machine software in the next version, they cannot perfectly protect themselves against computer hacking. If somebody were to manage to infiltrate their computer network, then they could get malware installed on every voting machine that is shipped from that company. And is that the company's fault? Well, sort of, except that we can't expect a company like that to be perfect in its own cybersecurity. We can ask it to, but it's just a very difficult task. So yes, all these machines can receive communications, it's just they do it through the removable media instead of through the modem. Yes?
Yeah, we have, as you pointed out there, we have the barcodes on our ballot receipt, that's what we call it, the ballot receipt. And we've been told here in Arkansas that those barcodes, in fact, cannot be wrong because they match the names on the ballot. However, in Northampton County, Pennsylvania, last November, that was proven by, it was on an ES&S machine, that the barcode did not match the name. Could you?
Yeah, let me talk about what strange thing happened in Northampton County. So let's come back to the picture, right? Here's your ballot card. It's got the barcodes, and it's got the human readable printout. And we are told that we can read this and be confident that it matches the barcodes, which are the ones that are actually counted. When you put it into the scanner, the optical scanner is not reading this stuff. And you would think that if the machine isn't hacked or something, then of course this must match this because the software would make sure of that. But in Northampton County last November, in an election where the machines were not hacked, they were just misprogrammed by accident. The ballot definition was a little screwed up by some mistake of the election workers. There were judge retention contests. Do you want to retain Judge Smith, yes or no? Do you want to retain Judge Jones, yes or no? And the selections, there were some voters that did want to retain Judge Smith, but did not want to retain Judge Jones. And they made their selections on here, and to their dismay, it came out backwards on there. And, and this happened early in the morning, so by mid-morning on election day, the election administrators in that county had looked into it and said, well, but the barcodes are right. So just go ahead and cast your votes. Don't worry about it that it says the wrong thing here. We've got you covered. The barcodes are correct. And the later forensic examination showed that that was true. The barcodes were the ones that the voters had selected. But the idea that this is supposed to be your protection against hacking, and now you're told, oh, don't worry if that's wrong, just go ahead and cast that vote anyway, is very disturbing. Yes?
Why can't the tabulator read the optical print we read and not have barcodes?
Good question. And the answer is it can, actually. Not this model, but there are ballot marking devices. If I go back to this one, for example, this one, but also many more modern ones that are sold today by other companies than ES&S. And what they print out is one of those optical scan bubble ballots. So it has the candidates' names, all the candidates in the contest with ovals, and the oval for which you voted is filled in with the black mark, and the optical scanner reads that optical scan bubble ballot just like it would read a hand-marked optical scan ballot. And there are no barcodes. You can see where the oval is filled in next to the name of the candidate you chose. And I talked to a vice president of Dominion a year or two ago, and he said, well, going forward, the ballot marking devices that they make are not going to have barcodes or QR codes on them. They will be the style where the human can see where the mark is in a way consistent with how it's going to be read by the optical scan voting machine. Now, I think barcodes to encode votes are a terrible idea for all the reasons we've been discussing. And so your idea that why can't it mark it in a way so that the way the computer will read it is the same as the way the human read it is an excellent idea. And all the other voting machine companies but this one have come to that conclusion. Okay? But even so, even if there were no barcodes on here at all, the ballot marking device is a really bad idea, and it's for the reason I explained before, that human beings, as long as humans are the voters, okay, they do not check. We can ask them to check, we can blame them for not checking, but the fact is they will not check. And so if the voting machine is hacked and prints wrong votes onto the ballot, even if they're very human readable, 93% of the voters won't notice, and the machine will still get away with stealing votes. So it is worse to have barcode ballots than the non-barcode ballots. That's true, but voting through a touchscreen is really also the main problem. Yes?
I have both a comment and a question. First of all, I have a friend who's one of these rare individuals who would actually raise his hand and say there's a problem. I read this and this is not the, and he just voted the other way in Sherwood here in Arkansas. And it was just some local issue, but he raised his hand and made it clear that that was not the selection he had just made. And he's a really big guy and a veteran, and he didn't care, but clearly they were trying to intimidate him. I mean, they held everything up for like 10 minutes. Everybody in the place knew that he was the problem. And so that's one of the reasons that you won't have many people even objecting if they,
Right,
you know,
which is
intimidate.
why I don't blame that 93% of the voters for being human. And maybe you're right that some of them do notice, but would rather not say something about it and raise a stink, which is, we should design a voting system that people can use without having to worry about feeling intimidated.
But now my question, so the only legitimate argument I can see against using paper ballots is somebody made this point to me that, okay, so what you have all of these issues, sometimes many more than this, maybe 50 or 70. I heard of a precinct somewhere, I don't remember, out west that has like 70 issues on one ballot. And you have to have hand count all of those, and have an individual, these individuals hand count those. How do you argue against that? Would it just be the idea of using the optical scanner?
Yeah, let me talk about the crazy state of California, where they will sometimes have 300 things to vote on, because they have all their candidates for president, senator, congressman, governor, legislator, state senator, mayor, dog catcher, right? All those contests. And then they have enormous numbers of judge retention contests. And then they have enormous number of referenda. And it's very typical for a California ballot to have like 300 things on it. Well, I think that's crazy, but that's the way they want to run their democracy over in California. Fine. And what do? They generally use hand-marked optical scan paper ballots counted by optical scanners, and then they do not actually recount or audit all the contests on the ballot. The ballots are there if they wanted to recount them, but it is truly a hard problem of how do you really effectively guard against hacking by any reasonable audit method when you have 300 things on the ballot. So in New Jersey, we do not have 300 things on the ballot. We have like 10. And if you're lucky, maybe around here you also don't have 300 things on the ballot, and it really will be possible to count by hand. But when we get to that point, I can talk about statistical random audits and how you can gain sufficient confidence that the machines weren't hacked by examining a sample of the ballots. So maybe I should explain that right now.
Can I ask about that?
Yeah, but let me ask, there's a question up there first.
You said that some states had adequate auditing, and only about 5 of them, if I remember.
Right.
Georgia was one of those that you said had adequate auditing.
Yeah, so Georgia has,
Don't I remember big problems in Georgia that they weren't able to resolve in the 2020 election?
here's what they found in Georgia. Number one, they were able to do what they called an audit, but was really a recount of all the ballots in the presidential election and the Senate race. And they were able to do that because they at least had paper ballots of some sort. The paper ballots they had were BMD, touchscreen marked ballots with QR codes on them. So that's already annoying that we can recount the paper ballots, and we can hope that the machines weren't hacked that time and that's really the voters' votes. And then they discovered that in some of the counties, the procedures for chain of custody of the ballot boxes and really just keeping track of how many ballots were cast and how many ballot boxes there should be were not as organized as they should have been. And that wasn't hacking, that's just a little bit sloppiness in election administration. And in the end, they did manage to recount all their paper ballots, and the outcome came out the same as what the machines had originally claimed in terms of those particular races that they recounted. But it was a little bit messy, and I think Georgia election administrators were a little bit embarrassed about a little bit of sloppiness in their procedures for keeping track of ballots and ballot boxes.
Did we count all the ballots or a sample?
They recounted all of them because it was an important election. And there were people motivated to recount all of them. Yes?
So I need to understand the how the ballot marking device actually counts and also how it actually steals the vote.
Okay.
So can you
Sure.
just go?
The ballot marking device doesn't actually count the votes. The way it works, you use the ballot marking device to indicate your selections. It prints them all onto this paper, and it doesn't remember them. Now you take the paper over to the optical scanner, and you deposit it in there, and that's the machine that's counting. Okay? And if the legitimate authorized software is in the ballot marking device, then it will accurately print what you selected onto the ballot card, except when there's a little screw up like in Northampton County, but that's rare. So almost all the time, it will get it right. And the problem is if some hacker had been able to install fraudulent software in that machine. And then what would that hacker design the fraudulent software to do? Well, when you interact with a touchscreen and you choose for Alderman Ward 1 position, whatever, John Smith, it would say, yes, ma'am, John Smith. It would give you that feedback on the screen, just the way you expected. But on here, it would print Eric Ford. That's assuming that the hacker wanted Eric Ford to be alderman in Ward 1. Okay, so the idea is the computer program can make you feel good on the screen by giving you the feedback as if nothing's wrong, but it would print something else in the barcode and maybe decide also to print something else in the human readable part.
Would it be your expert opinion that those barcodes, like if there is hacking going on, that if people are checking and it does say correct, that it is happening with the difference in the barcode? That the barcode is where they're
If you're
possibly
hacking to
manipulating the vote?
If you're hacking to change the outcome of election, you would have to make it print the wrong barcode, to print the barcode for the candidate that you want to win, because that's what's going to be counted by the optical scanner. Now, if you're the hacker, you have a choice. Do you print the name here that matches the barcode and hope the voter won't notice? If you do that, then your hack will survive even a hand recount of the human readable part. Or do you presume the voter might notice, so you print the name of the voter's preferred candidate here, but you put a fraudulent barcode there. Then you've stolen the vote in the first count. Will it survive in the recount? Only if your state does recounts by running these through the same optical scanners again that counts the barcodes, which your state does. Okay, so not all hacks are going to be designed the same. The hacker has a wide range of creative options for cheating. Hacker has to decide what percentage of the votes to steal and hope to get away with it. There's no one answer to that question. Yes?
So my question is identity. When I come up and I scan, it gives me my ballot. Is there anything linking that ballot to me all the way through the process?
Answer is no.
Do they have a record on us? Is
No.
there a way to do that?
Here's what, when you go to the check-in desk and you sign the poll book and they look up which precinct you're in, then what they give you is the ballot card with only this much printed on it. And what's in here is your precinct number. Not any more about your identity than the precinct number. So if there's 800 registered voters in your precinct, that's how much they know about you. Yes?
Can you go back to the 2024 screen where it shows the map of the country?
Right here.
So looking at Arkansas,
Yeah.
in your opinion, why is it yellow? Why won't it go to hand-marked paper ballots? Why did almost, looks like 95% of the whole US go? Why is Arkansas so
I think it's a
opposed?
question we all have.
You could ask the same question about New Jersey, I am embarrassed to say, because that's where I live. And it's not a whole lot better in New Jersey. You know, the voting machine salesmen are very persuasive. They make things convenient for the election administrators who are their customers. When you outfit a polling place with ballot marking devices at $8,000 a pop, you need a bunch of them. So what you need, because the voter, as a voter, you have to interact with that touchscreen for like 2 minutes. And so to accommodate a good flow of voters, you need like 6 of these touchscreens lined up and maybe 1 optical scanner, because when you come over and deposit the ballot, that only occupies the optical scanner for 10 seconds. Now, if you had hand-marked paper ballots, you would need enough $100 cardboard privacy booths for 6 voters at once, and enough 50-cent pens for 6 voters at once, and 1 optical scanner machine. So which one is going to make the voting machine salesman more money?
Again,
You know,
who's making that call?
well, I don't know exactly how it works in Arkansas. I can tell you it works in my state or other states, right? The election administrators make recommendations to, they don't get to make the decision, but they make recommendations to the county boards. And the county boards mostly defer to them because the election administrators know how to run elections, and the county boards just hope they do a good job. And if the election administrators say, this is the equipment we need, then the county boards will often go along. And they'll especially do it if there's grants so that somebody else is paying, which there often have been. So, you know, it doesn't take a conspiracy theory or anything. It's just, it just flows along. Yes?
Okay, so, I mean, by that map, if it's hand-marked paper ballots, then why did we have such a problem in 2020? Because, wait a minute, it was worse in 2020. There were less hand-marked paper ballots. But I don't see that the hand-marked paper ballots, it obviously is these counting machines also.
Well, which states are we talking about? Right? When you want to identify a problem in a particular election, as we know, the national popular vote is not what matters. It's the electoral vote in each state and the Senate vote in each state. And so when you say there was a problem in some particular state, you got to say, well, what voting machines was that state using and what was done to investigate? And so I believe in Arizona, they suspected the voting machines had been hacked, so they did a forensic examination and they recounted all the paper ballots. And they determined that the result came out the same by hand counting of all the paper ballots as the machines claimed originally. So by that evidence, it appears that the machines in that particular state, in that particular election, were not hacked. And it's good that they had those paper ballots that were marked with the voters with a pen that they could recount.
Some people, you know, they've believed for the last 4 years there were issues, but you're not here to talk about something that might have happened in 2020. You are wanting to show how things should be done to the best.
If there were evidence that the voting machines were actually hacked in a particular state, in a particular election, I would certainly be talking about it. I just haven't seen that evidence. There were screw-ups, right? There was a county in Michigan that by accident got their ballot definition files wrong, and the optical scanners were reading votes for this candidate as if they were votes for that candidate. And the election officials noticed that the results were screwy, that the preliminary results from the optical scanners made no sense. So they did not certify those results. The very next day, they started hand counting all the paper ballots in that county, and the results that they certified, which were from the hand count, which differed greatly from the machine count, were accurate because it was from hand counts very carefully, because once the controversy comes up, then you pay a lot of attention to that hand count. There was a county in the 2020 election in New Hampshire. I think it was like right about here. There was a town, Windham, New Hampshire, where the optical scan ballot machines, it turned out, got the wrong answer. Not because they were hacked, but because they were, clogged with dust in a way that the sensor couldn't read the vote properly. And there was a hand recount that got a different count by far than the original count, and that caused great concern in the state of New Hampshire, and they did a whole forensic investigation on what went wrong, and they got to the bottom of it. So there are places where there's evidence that the machines screwed up. Not generally that it was hacked on purpose, but mistakes were made and screw-ups happen, and the ability to have those paper ballots and recount them was very valuable. Yes?
I don't know, be driving people nuts, but this is a big deal to me. So if we have hand-marked paper ballots,
Yep.
and yet we still take them and put them in an optical scan machine
Mm-hmm.
that is still hackable,
That's right.
I don't see any purpose in that.
Okay, so number one, people working in teams like this team is counting the ballots. There's, two people looking at each ballot, one to call out what the vote's on it, one, there's a certain way of organizing the team to count the ballots by hand. Even so, people can make mistakes. Miss one in the hundreds column when you're copying things over. And this takes a while. It'll take a couple days after the election, and people want their results right away. And it's reasonable for people to want their results right away. If you count the ballots by an optical scan machine that has no capability to make more marks on the paper, then you're certainly doing no harm, and you're getting your preliminary result right away. And by the way, if you get a result here, and then you get a quite different result here, something's wrong. It's possible that what's wrong is the hand count. So then you do another hand count, you do the forensic examination, you see what's right. I think this count is valuable. It gives you an extra check even on the hand count. The one that you trust in the end may be the hand double check, and not this one, but this one still has value.
It's similar to a bank, right? You go withdraw money, the first thing they do, they stick it in a machine, but before they ever hand it to you, they hand count every single bill. So they do a double check count at the banks when you withdraw large amounts of money. So it's similar idea of having two counts to make sure they're correct and match up.
Also to get an immediate result that same night, no more of this, we won't have results for 2 weeks or whatever, just that very evening. You have a preliminary result,
but you have a result here that's before anyone's had a chance to mess with the paper ballot chain of custody, and that can be valuable too.
So if you have the hand count and it goes to the machine, and what is sent to wherever is, all right.
All right, let's talk about what's sent to where, right. So
the flash drive or whatever that they're using is being sent over the internet somewhere else. So I've done the paper ballot.
Mm-hmm.
I've put it through the counting machine, and now I'm taking that flash drive and I'm putting it somewhere on the internet.
Let's talk about procedures then. What actually happens on election night? And these procedures vary by different states and different counties, so your mileage may vary, but it works something like this. When they close the polls, this machine prints out basically a cash register tape with the election results on it from that machine. And there's a flash drive they can pull out of it that has the totals in a digital form. And then they take that flash drive, they may drive it over to the county election office on election night. In some counties, they will put it in another machine that transmits it electronically over the internet to the county election office, but I would recommend driving it over with 2 people in the car. Okay, and they count it on election night, and it doesn't take long. You stick it in the machine and it's uploaded that precinct's figures, and they can announce their totals on election night. Meanwhile, the paper ballots are also important. And the paper ballots typically they will be taken out of the ballot box in the presence of the witnesses in the polling place at the close of the polls, put in a sealable bag. The seal gets put on the bag. I know how to replace and remove those seals without evidence of tampering, so I'm not going to put all my faith in the seals. I'm going to put my faith in that the same 2 people that are keeping an eye on each other drive it over to the county central office where they put it in the vault. And now what you have is the digital claims from the machine, which are accurate if not hacked, and you have the paper ballots that were marked by the voters and that the machines have not had a chance to alter the marks on, that are in the vault and ready for the audit or the recount. So I don't know if that explains the process well enough to see how the pieces fit together.
Because I am a poll worker, so I am familiar with this, and I do know that we drive it over and they do that information there, but it is sent from that county office somewhere, not by driving it,
Right.
but by over the internet.
Right.
So we've done the paper ballots, and it goes from us, and we've made sure it's correct, and we can go back and audit that. How do we know that information from
a few days later, the county officials have to certify the official count. All right? And how exactly that works in Arkansas, if only we had somebody who could answer that question. Can you answer that question?
I can tell you how we do it.
Okay.
We did it this last year.
And where are you from?
My name is Laurie Gross. I'm a commissioner in Searcy County, and we are voting with paper ballots this year. And the way that we certified is it's a law that you have to run the ballots through the scanner that night, election night. You have to get a preliminary count of your election to the Secretary of State's office. And there is software to do that is very protected in a certain kind of way. Probably it's not protected to you, but it's protected to the rest of us who don't understand how it's protected. But that's how we send in our preliminary count based on our scanners. Then the next day, we hand count our ballots and we compare the two.
How long does it take to do the hand count?
Well, we are a small county. We had just under 1,700 ballots in the primary, which was a very small primary, even for us. And it took us about 5 hours actually to count.
And how many people were on the team that did the count?
We had 30 people who were counting.
So you did it in like teams of 5 or something?
We had teams of 6. For the general, we're doing teams of 4. So 2 people looking at the ballot, 1 calling it, and 2 talliers.
All right. And if you were a larger county with maybe 8,000 votes, how many votes actually get cast in Independence County typically? Anybody? I don't know. I mean,
the last general, it was around 12,000.
All right.
So this was the question I had earlier.
Yeah.
So if you have the paper ballots and you get your preliminary count with your optical scanner the night of the election.
Right.
And then rather than depending on counting all of your ballots by hand,
Yep.
you decided to do what do you call it, a self-limiting audit?
A risk limiting. I'll talk in a minute about the mechanics of risk
Let me
limiting.
ask how it might work though, because we're talking about doing this in our county. Right now, we count every ballot, and we will be doing that in the general election because we wanted to hand count every ballot. But
Right.
what if, to check our scanners, if we randomly selected in the day or 2 or 3 days following the election, if we randomly selected a precinct here and a precinct there and hand counted those precincts, would that be sufficient to prove that our scanners were not hacked?
Unfortunately, no.
Oh.
And
Say
unfortunately,
that.
that's the way that most states' audit law
Okay.
works. And it's a good idea. It just turns out not to statistically work very effectively. So I can describe how a more efficient kind of risk limiting audit works. And let me do that in a minute, but let's finish answering her question about, how do the results get certified when, for the official certification of the results that any county has to do, not election night, but a couple days later. And most counties do without any kind of audit or recount, right? But whether there's an audit or recount or not, how does that certification actually work back to the Secretary of State?
We have paperwork that our clerk fills out based on all of our data that we've collected while we were counting, because you have provisionals,
Right, and all of
Right,
that
that you have to
would be
check.
true in any county.
right? You have
Right.
absentees, you have all of these. Once all of those are checked and double checked, then the election commissioners working with the clerk will certify that this is a valid count.
Right.
And these are the numbers from each of our precincts.
Right.
And
And is that
then
certification a thing on paper,
It's
or
on
is
paper.
and it's sent like physically,
Yes.
not just through the internet?
Yeah, the preliminary count is sent through the internet, but the certification is on paper.
Okay.
And it's stamped. And
So does
notarized.
that answer your question?
I'd like to add, the Secretary of State then posts the certified numbers on their website so the counties can go check that their count matches what was on the website from the Secretary of State.
Right.
See, we didn't know that in the preliminary.
Now, let me come back to risk limiting audits. The voting machines produce a data file called a cast vote record file. And there's one line it's called CVR, cast vote record. And in that file, there's one line per ballot. And on that line is what were all the votes on that ballot. So you have this big data file, and there's as many lines in the file as there are ballots cast. And if you added up the votes in the cast vote record file, it ought to come out to the same as the totals claimed by the machine. And you can view this CVR file as the voting machine's claim about what's actually on the paper ballots. Now, suppose you were suspicious and you wanted to check up on the voting machine about whether its claims are accurate. What you could do is pick a random line in the CVR file and go find that corresponding ballot and see if it has the same votes on it that the voting machine claimed. Oh, good, it does. Let's try another one. Pick a random line from the CVR file and figure out which ballot box that's in and pull that ballot box and go through and find that ballot and see if it says what the voting machine claimed. Now, if the margin of victory was very large, then by just doing 100 of those samples, you could get very high confidence that if the voting machine was cheating on some of those lines, it couldn't have been cheating on enough to alter the outcome of the election without you having caught it in the audit. So that's called a ballot comparison risk limiting audit, and it can be very efficient. However, if the margin of victory is very tiny, then you have to sample more and more and more to make sure that it couldn't sneak a few through. So the efficiency of a risk limiting audit, they're very efficient when the margin of victory is large, and when the margin of victory is small, you have to sample more and more ballots, and at a certain point, if it's really that close, you might as well just recount them all by hand. Now, the number of ballots you have to pull in that is about the same whether you have 1 million ballots or 10,000 ballots. In other words, you don't have to pull a fixed percentage. It turns out, the way the statistics work, you might have to pull 800 ballots. And that would be true whether you have 1 million ballots, you pull 800 and that's enough, or whether you have 10,000 ballots, pulling 800 is enough. And to pull a ballot, it's not as simple as just counting it. You have to go find which is the right ballot from all the ballot boxes you have, and find the right ballot in that ballot box. And there's some overhead to that. So it turns out if all you have to do is 10 or 12,000 ballots, it might be just as easy to recount them all by hand, and that would be the most efficient form of audit. So if you're in a county with 150,000 ballots every election, one of these statistical methods is probably the best one to use. And if you're in a county with 12,000 ballots, then the most sophisticated way is just count the ballots. Yes?
Can you define a small margin?
Well, again, if the margin is 3%, that's a pretty big margin. And, you know, a small sample will do. If the margin is, you know, if it's 63% to 37%, that's a huge margin. And just counting a few will do. But sometimes you get elections that are really, really close, and this statistical method just, in the end, degenerates to you have to recount everything, and there's just no getting around it. Yes?
So our county officials, and specifically the county attorney here, have said that we're trying to solve a non-existing problem by going this way. Could you explain how?
Well, as a computer scientist, I know that computers can be hacked by replacing their software. Or as a reader of newspapers, I know that computers can be hacked by replacing their software. And even though we have not seen evidence of voting machines actually having been hacked in elections, there are some suspicions in 1 or 2 small elections, but not the major ones you've heard of. We know that it's still possible the next time. And so if you want to just close your eyes and hope it's not going to happen the next time, then you can get away with letting the computers count your vote. And if you want to be able to trust the outcomes of the elections, even independent from what software might be installed in the computers next year, then you need to have some sort of audit procedure for the actual paper ballots that the voters marked.
So that was the main point that they would say, and then the second point, almost immediately, was cost. Well, we just don't know how much it's going to cost. It could put the county in the red.
Right. Well, you can measure the cost. So the cost of hand-marked paper ballots compared to the cost of the touchscreens, well, if you do it right, the hand-marked paper ballots cost less. If you find a really expensive ballot printing company, they can cost more. And somehow my county in New Jersey managed to do that. But there are all sorts of ways to efficiently print paper ballots. There's even ballot on-demand printers where there's a little printer right at the e-poll book where you sign in, and it prints out the right ballot style for you to fill in by hand. And that can be very cost effective. So, and then finally, the cost of the touch screens where were we? Well, you need a bunch of these in the polling place. And they're like $8,000 a piece, and they have an annual licensing cost. So there's a continuing expense to those. They are more expensive than pens. Okay. And I think you could speak to what happened to the costs in Searcy County when you switched to hand-marked paper ballots.
I can, I have my numbers. Do you want me to share?
Yes.
Yes.
So, I'll stand up so y'all can hear me. What we did was we compared, after we finished our primary, and we were putting together our report to be reimbursed by the state, because the state reimburses a significant portion of a county's cost in the primary election. And so there's extensive paperwork. It's very detailed that you fill out, and you do it every election. You fill out one of those, every primary election, you fill out that paperwork. So when I had filled out that paperwork for the 24 primary, I went back to the paperwork from the 22 primary, and I looked at all of the columns and compared them. I compared payroll, I compared printing costs, I compared our cost with ES&S. And because we had been told that if we went to paper ballots, it would bankrupt our county. That's what we had been told.
That's what they say, yeah.
And they had asked a group of us to do some research to try to figure out if that was true. And all the research we did kept saying, there's no way, it's got to cost less. But we didn't know for sure until we held an election. And so when I put all of the numbers together, in 2022 primary, we spent almost $43,000 on our primary. Now that's not static expenses like what it costs to have a payroll, but it is the payroll cost, right? It's the cost of putting on that particular election. It's actually $42,974.72, just in case you're detail oriented. In 24 primary, we spent $35,906.64. So we saved $7,000.68, $7,068.08.
Now, does that $35,000 cost include the cost of hand counting as well as the ballot
Yes,
print?
Everything.
Everything.
Wow.
Everything. But let me say this. About half of the people who counted our ballots volunteered their time. We gave them the option. We were willing to pay them. Our county is a small county. It's not a wealthy county. And so for our county to save $7,000 is significant because we have a lot of needs in our county that are not being met. So when we started looking at this, I was on the fence because electronic machines are easy.
Yeah.
If you're running an election, they're very convenient. And I really didn't want to give up that convenience. But when I started doing the research, somebody convinced me that the machines might be hackable. I didn't like that idea.
It's a very uncomfortable idea.
It doesn't seem smart to process something that's so important. But for me, I was thinking it is ridiculous to be paying the amount of money we are spending on elections. It's a horrific expense, and it's not necessary. In this state, if you go to paper ballots, you will still have some required expenses because of the laws that tie us to ES&S. We're shackled to ES&S expenses. And until some laws are changed, there will be expenses I consider unnecessary, but we still have to pay them because of ES&S. Yes,
So
sir.
we can't choose a different vendor?
No, the Secretary of State has,
That's correct.
the Secretary of State chose the machines. They've ordered the counties to use those machines. By law, we are required to do certain things. We have to have a DS-200 count all of our
So
ballots.
the DS-200 is the optical scanner.
Right,
So even in all the counties that are using the touch screens, that's just to mark the ballot. The optical scanner that counts it is the ES&S model DS-200, and every county has those, and your county has those. You just use them in a different way. You use them
Right.
to count the hand-marked paper ballots.
we do, and we like being
Now-
able to do that.
Independence County undoubtedly owns a bunch of those optical scanners right now, and it's those same scanners that you would use to count the hand-marked paper ballots. You would not need to buy new equipment.
Right.
You could stop using the touch screens or reserve one touch screen in each polling place for disabled voters who can't mark a paper ballot by hand. And actually having that accommodation is required by federal law since 2002, right?
Yep.
But you do not need new equipment.
Look at the question of how much it would have cost had you paid those workers that just volunteered their time.
There were about 15 of them that volunteered their time. It wouldn't have been a significant difference. Right.
Well, I already added it up real quick, looks like to me about $3,000. So if you save 7, so you still save 4, even if you had to pay them. Even if you had to pay the people.
For 6 hours, 15 people for 6 hours.
Right.
That's a lot of money for 6 hours.
Hey, Lori,
Yes, sir.
the one bad thing about being stuck with the SNS, which is chosen by the Secretary of State, is you have number one, which federal law requires, you had to pay how much to be able to have a program for ESNS to run that one machine?
Our ES&S expenses were, in the 22 primary, they were 13,000, and in our 24 primary, they were 6,000. And we were paying some license fees that we actually should not have been paying, and I found those when I was doing the research, so we stopped paying those fees. We also, in using many fewer, instead of using 24 of the voting machines, we only used 10 of them. Actually, we used 9 of them. That also saved us some money because they charge a lot for every program that you have to have. And there were some other places where we saved money with the ES&S because of that.
And I seem to remember you talking about, it's been quite some time since the ES&S had come out and done maintenance on those machines, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And then they showed up, how far before this election were you going to paper ballots?
Well, counties don't pay maintenance on their machines right now because...
Not the cost. It's like, if they had not showed up in a long time.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, they showed up.
Their maintenance just before you were going to do this, basically a full audit of the machines, because your hand count system is a full audit. And suddenly they're interested in showing up and doing maintenance on the machines, correct?
Yeah, they showed up a month before the election, maybe before the primary, just out of the blue. They didn't make an appointment with me. They just, our clerk called and said, hey, these guys are here to do maintenance on the machines. And I said, no, because I thought they were going to charge us, and we didn't need maintenance on the machines.
Several years prior to that they come back.
They had not been there in quite a while. They came and they went in and they worked on all of the machines. We don't know what they did.
Because they didn't know which machines you were going to use.
Right, because we didn't use all of them.
But don't they charge a fee every year for maintenance?
No.
No?
Right now, they do not. I guess they probably charge a fee, but the state pays it. The county doesn't pay maintenance fee on the machines.
Okay.
Right now. Now, I promise you that will change. We are looking at having to replace, the machines last 10 to 15 years max. Our machines, well, that's what the Secretary of State said. And we've had, our machines are 2016 models. And so we are looking in our state needing to replace our machines fairly soon. They're fairly obsolete. And originally, our ballot casting machines, our express votes machines, cost $4,000. The new ones cost $8,000. He was saying $8,000. And the Secretary of State estimated it will cost the state about $50 million to replace the machines in the state. Senator Hammer actually asked her, has the state made provision to start setting money aside to start paying for these machines in the next handful of years? And she said, no, we have no provision to set aside money to buy these machines. It's my theory that the counties will be required to bear a significant cost of those machines. If you're doing paper ballots, you will still have to purchase some machines. But for us, instead of the 12 counting machines or optical scanners, the DS200s, we will only need 4. That's it's huge savings right there for our county. And instead of 24 ballot marking devices, we will only need 9 or 10. Again, significant savings at the end. I mean, you save at the election time, but the huge savings for a county is when you have to replace these machines.
My understanding is we have some precincts and some counties here, you're the one that told me this, don't we have some counties that have not used these machines because they're expensive, like, go back to the map.
Yeah, let's go back to the map.
Yeah, because I think there's the reason the ones Yeah, there they are.
All right. So
That was.
I was told today by somebody in the room who might know that in Pulaski County, in the early vote centers, they used the touchscreen machines. But in the election day precincts, of which they have a lot, they use hand-marked paper ballots. All right. And that's not unique to that county in Arkansas. There are other places in other states where the equipment in the early vote center is different than the equipment in the precincts. You need a lot more of the ones in the precincts. If you don't have hundreds and hundreds of touchscreens, you can't put one in every precinct. So you have to buy hundreds and hundreds of pens. And yes.
That, yeah, in Pulaski County, you're right, that's exactly what they do. They do hand-mark paper ballots on election day, and they all go back to the precincts to do that. They don't have hand counting though. They don't. And the term audit is thrown around so much by the people who are supporting the current machines, and most people never dive into that meaning. Tell me exactly what you do, because they often, I've seen this over and over again, they'll say, we do audits here in Arkansas. In fact, we had a pilot program in 2020, we did 5 counties. And then in 2022, we did 20 counties. And we had 60,000 ballots that we looked at, we audited, not one mistake, 100% accuracy. What they don't tell you is, that it's not the audit that Dr. Appel's talking about. The audit they're talking about is they go to only the general election, never the primary, and any cheating that would occur in a solid red state most likely would be in a primary. They don't look at primaries, they look at the general elections. And in the general election, they take one race. And in 2020, they took the presidential race, which was Trump's race. And they go to 7 or 8, in that case, 5 counties. They go to an election commissioner's office. They say, give me 1, 2, 3, give me those 8 boxes. Each box representing one of the machines in that county. One of the machines is counted, one of the DS200. And they go, they open up the box, it's got a tape in there, and it says, there's 500 ballots in this box. They count all 500 ballots. Yep, there's 500 ballots in here. And there's supposed to be 450 votes for Trump and 50 for Biden. Yep, that's it. Then go to the next one.
Now,
they do that. And
that is a quite weak kind of audit. It is typical of many states to have that kind of, if you look at all the states in gray, well, most of them have an audit law. Most of them have audits kind of like that. Arkansas is not an outlier in that regard. You're right in there with everybody else, right? You could do better. This county could do better.
We did check that in 2023. So we do the audits of the primaries now.
Right. Well,
It's that same week audit.
let me tell you about a technical term, risk limiting audit. That is a specific scientific term for any audit that if the machines were hacked to give a different outcome to what you'd find by counting the votes the voters actually marked, it would have an X% chance of catching it. That's your risk limit. And you can design it for whatever risk limit you think is appropriate. Many states design it for a 95% risk limit. Okay? And so all the weak kind of audits that many states are doing, including what Conrad described, are not risk limiting audits. They're just bullshit audits, or audits, as we call them. Okay? And recounting all the paper ballots in your county would be a legitimate form of risk limiting audit.
Can we also add that the audits that are currently happening in Arkansas are well after the election, and in this election code it says cannot affect the outcome of a race.
So there are 3 states where they have risk limiting audits that are actually binding on election outcomes. The audit itself does not determine the election outcome, but the audit tells you whether you need a recount, and you need to do that audit before certification. Obviously. It's 3 states. Let's see. I believe it's Colorado, Virginia, and Rhode Island that have binding risk limiting audits. So the country's not in a great place for being able to trust our election results independent of the computers. And Colorado and Virginia and Rhode Island are way ahead of the game, and some of these other states are doing okay-ish. And your county could be right up there with the leaders of them. Yes?
This question's more for, I'm sorry, I forgot.
Lori.
Lori. We have 15, in the state of Arkansas, we get 15 days for hand count. Because I've heard over and over again, it
Before
has
you
to be done
certify.
in 24 hours and it couldn't be done.
You don't have to do it in 24
10
hours.
days for
You have to
the
have,
election, 10 days after primary.
yeah, 10 days.
The 24 hours is the preliminary count from the machine.
Right.
You have 24 hours for
24
that.
hours. Okay, because I've heard the 24 hours number being used as an argument against it, and I thought, I can't believe that.
You have a
that's all
whole
the
week.
Time we allow.
You have a whole week to hand count.
The way I set up the law was, you had, so basically you got 10 days, but I set it up for, you got a buffer. So you had to have your hand count finished in before 24 hours. You had to have it done 24 hours before the deadline. So basically you had 9 days of actual counting for a primary and 14 days for the general election. I wanted that buffer there just in case somebody was new and they didn't bring in enough people because they were optimistic or whatever, and they just could not get it done. Then, the worst case scenario, then the machine counted vote would be the official count.
We chose to do it the day after, and we did the whole count the day after, and we're gonna do that again, because the less time after they're voted, the more tamper-proof your ballots are. That makes sense, if I'm using.
Yep.
You really want, it's like he said, you wanna run them through that machine as soon as possible after they have been voted. But what we wanted to do was one night in the vault, and then the next day they were all counted. So very little opportunity for somebody to say, oh, somebody else had access to those ballots to change them or whatever. And so that's why we
Can
counted.
you tell them also about what you did on your hand counting as far as the cameras, the recording, that anybody can go back and look at all the ballots you did? Can you explain that to them real quick?
Yeah, we had scanners at each table, so we did the ballots, we counted the ballots in batches of no more than 25. So we would take 25 with a cover sheet that identified that batch as, say, batch 1 in that precinct, and we scanned it onto a thumb drive. So we had a digital record of every ballot in its batch. We counted those. The tally sheets had to equal with the 2 different talliers. Then those went with that batch. At the same time, we had cameras over each table. So when the ballots were counted, they were underneath a camera that then recorded. I don't know all the technical terms. These guys know them. We had screens. So people who came to watch the counting process could look at a big screen and they could see the ballots as they were being counted and the tally was being called out. We wanted to show our county that our counting process was very, very open. We didn't want, because one of the things I read when I was reading about ballots is problems happen when things are done behind closed doors or in the dark. Like if ballots are counted in a box, but you don't see them counted outside of the box. So we wanted anybody to be able to watch our ballot counting process because we wanted them to know that it was, here's the word I'm looking for.
Transparent.
It was very transparent. Thank you.
I want people to be able to trust our elections
Yes.
for the right reasons.
That's right.
Yes.
I just wanted to confirm that I heard this right. So you're saying that in the state of Arkansas, our DS200 machines can be used as the optical scanning machines?
That is correct.
Okay.
If we go back to the national map, about half of those states are using ES&S DS200s to count their hand-marked optical stand paper ballots. And about a third of the states are using Dominion optical scanners. And then there's 2 or 3 other smaller companies in the market, And the DS200s can be used to count the barcode ballots or the hand-marked ballots.
But there are cheaper ones, correct? There are cheaper ones on the market.
Dominion makes a pretty good machine that is half the cost of the ES&S machine. And there's a company called Hart that makes a perfectly good machine. And there's another company whose name will come to me in a second.
But we don't get to shop around in Arkansas. We have a monopoly on ours. It's only ES&S.
There are a lot of states where the Secretary of State is responsible for determining that a machine is safe to use and will certify 2 or 3 different makers' machines, and the counties can choose. And there's some states where everybody's got to use the same machine.
Is there an optical scanner that's less hackable than one another?
Probably not. Which is to say, these are complicated machines. We don't get to really tear them apart and test how hackable they are. So I just assume that they're all hackable, each in their own idiosyncratic ways. And I think a lot of counties across the US have improved their cybersecurity a lot over the past 8 or 10 years. Not just in elections, but in all their county operations, right? They have trained their employees not to respond to phishing emails, which nobody had ever heard of 10 years ago, at least among county employees in certain counties in Florida or whatever. But, you know, things have gotten better, but I wouldn't want to recommend this brand of voting machine versus that brand because I think one is less hackable than the other. I just don't have the evidence for that.
Is there something going on with Oklahoma that's a different shade of green? Schedule or something?
I would have to look on, so let me, this source comes from the Verified Voting Foundation. If you go to verifiedvoting.org, you can find the interactive version of this map, and it has a more complete key to what the colors mean. Verified Voting is a nonprofit, nonpartisan foundation that does 2 things. First of all, it gathers information on how we're actually voting in every county in the US and exactly what model of voting machine every county is using, so you can just look it up. And it has it for every even-numbered year going back to 2006. So when I have these maps from different years, that's where I'm getting it. And the other thing they do is they advocate for verified voting, that you can trust the count of the vote independent of the computer because you saw what was on your ballot and the human being who counted that ballot in a recount or an audit could see the same thing you saw. And they also have consultants available who will help counties implement audits if that's the kind of thing you want. So if you wanted to know what the light green means, you could go to verifiedvoting.org and sort of look it up. Yes. There was a question back there somewhere. Yes.
Just so, I have 2 questions. One, just so I understand this correctly, because our Secretary of State says that we have no modems in any of our equipment. You're saying if they were to be hacked, it would be piggyback malware on like the jump drives?
That would be a typical way. It would be, right. It's very likely true what your Secretary of State says, that the voting machines themselves, the touch screens and the optical scanners do not have modems and do not have network connections. But the hacks that have been demonstrated and the way that we know for sure that software gets loaded into those machines when it's for legitimate purposes is through the jump drives.
And some of that could not show up till election day, correct?
You could install malware in the machine that sits there. It knows which Tuesday in November is going to be election day in 2028. I can program that now. And it knows that there's going to be a Republican Party and a Democratic Party in 2028. And it probably knows even in the Senate primary who's going to be running, right? You can program it far in advance to cheat just on election day and never cheat before election day when it's being tested.
And the second question is on those poll books. I've been told, and I don't know if you know this or not, but where does that data come from? Is it from ES&S servers?
Okay, so let's talk about the poll books. In the old days, You would go into your own local precinct and there would be a paper poll book and you would sign it. And when you have early vote centers where your county might have 2 vote centers and you can go into any vote center in your county and it'll pull up the ballot for your precinct. And those electronic poll books are typically connected to the internet. And there's a good reason to connect those to the internet because they don't want you going across the county to the other vote center and voting also. So they need to look up whether you already voted. And the data from that comes from your county or your state voter registration database, which is maintained by your county election officials. And your county election officials may hire a service company like ES&S or another one to help run that. And that's a business of contracting, and I can't tell you how your county does it.
So we would just have to look that up to find out if ES&S does go.
ES&S has all of our state records. They maintain our voter records.
Yeah, ES&S stands for Election Systems and Services. They are, among other things, a services company, and they will sell that service to any county that wants it. And, you know.
And that makes me also question, so now when we walk in, our driver's license is scanned, coded. So that would, in my mind, say that now they have access to my driver's license number, all the information that's on the card.
Right, but any company that's making software to help run your Department of Motor Vehicles, you know, the state has that information. They're the one that issued you the driver's license. And any service companies. Right, so it is a privacy concern, but the hand-marked paper ballots are not going to solve that problem because we still need voter registration. And we still need a system for voter registration, and computers are likely to be involved. So it's maybe worth addressing that problem, but I think it's a separate issue from the way the ballots get counted.
You got time for one more question?
So Heritage ranks states, and they say Arkansas is 7.
That's what
The Heritage Foundation is not a place where you find cybersecurity expertise. They do what they do. And I am not a political scientist. I just know how the technology works.
So where did you rank Arkansas at as a computer scientist?
Well, let's see. It's ahead of Louisiana. It's ahead of Tennessee and Indiana. All right. But I think that using ballot marking device touchscreens for all voters is a really bad practice. And I think it has to rank behind most of the states that are voting on hand-marked paper ballots.
Yeah, because we have state senators and state reps that stand up and say, we don't need to change because Heritage ranks us number 7.
Well,
That ranking is based on, we did.
Well, how is that ranking done?
We did about 20 bills last time.
47.
For everything like, doing away with the possibility of county officials harvesting ballots like at old folks' homes, that type of thing. We said we can't do ballot type ballots.
there's a whole bunch of other decisions that a state can make about how they run their elections that I'm not talking about, and I'm not offering an opinion on. Absentee ballot versus in-person, early vote centers versus in the precincts, you know, how you authenticate voters, you know, do you need voter ID at the polling place or not? Those are all sorts of reasonable questions that states have to answer for themselves, which is a really separate issue from how do you count the marks on the ballot, which is really the subject of what I've been talking about here. And it could be that the Heritage Foundation's rankings are based on many of those factors. That's what you're saying.
By the way, our
right?
score is a 69 with Heritage, so out of 100.
But I wanted to end it here. I want to thank Professor Appel for coming. This is the first time he's been back to Arkansas since 1972. So I thank you for taking the time out of his life to come down here to try to help educate us and help us understand why we must get rid of these machines and go to the gold standard, which he's just outlined. And so thank you, Dr. Appel, for coming. I really appreciate it. I think it's a round of applause, I think. And I took him to a whole hog cafe today, so he's got a little bit of Arkansas barbecue in there. So, what's that?
Oh, yes.
Oh yeah, make sure you vote yes on paper ballots. And tell all your friends and make sure they go. Because you are the first county that votes in the state of Arkansas that the people are able to vote whether they want paper ballots or not. And we got to show the rest of the state, yes, people want it. We know you do, but you got to go vote. You got to get your friends to go vote. So, yes, sir.
I just wanted to thank Representative Long for coming out.
Yeah, I want to recognize you. Out of all of the representatives, I will tell you, he's the only one
It's
that
curious.
has been open to listening to the argument and open and willing to try to help the paper ballot movement. And I thank you very much for that.
Yes, yes.
On his own dime.
Yeah.
He's not from Independence County. He's the only one I know that observed yours as an elected official.
He was there all day while we counted,
And
all day.
I don't think we were.
Both did,
yeah. Paid for that one either, were you? No. So.
On his own time. Thank you
I'd
very
like to
much.
see more of that in the legislature, honestly.
Yeah.
The Leslie here's, if all goes well in this election, she's gonna be the Republican win.
Cleburne County, right?
County.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, that's right. Well, thank you very much.